Welcome in Brussels.
Thank you.
Second time.
Second time.
First time was almost 10 years ago.
Yeah, it was 2011.
What was the reason then that you were?
I was coming to visit the Royal Museum, Central Africa, and there was a thought about my work actually coming to the museum, and I made a visit, and that visit informed me in a different way of understanding and looking at African art in a different context than I'm used to seeing it in the States. So back then that was a visit. I enjoy going to museums and walking, especially museums that have older objects, because part of it is, one of my fascinations when I was a student in art school was, well, the places where I would gather material was from like antique shops. And the interest was being able to step back in time and towards a time period that I didn't know much about. So for me, that visit was about that.
I want to go back to Atlanta because I think your work is Atlanta, I think. Can I?
In a strange way, yes.
In a strange way, perhaps you can explain it a little bit more for why Atlanta is so important for you, for your work, for everything you do, I think.
Yeah, in some ways. Yeah, part of it is that I was born in New Jersey, but I grew up in Atlanta. My parents moved to Atlanta in like '72. And for me, it was more about that same idea about stepping back in time. I didn't know, I didn't understand, but my mother was real interested in history, so sometimes my mother would take me to different places. Like take, for instance, as a kid, I remember going to see, there's a guy named George Washington Carver, and George Washington Carver created a lot of practices and uses for the peanut. But he was a scientist, so my mother, I remember as a kid, I may have been like 7, and I remember going to this university, it's Tuskegee University, where George Washington Carver was, and he had a lab there, and I just remember going to those kind of places. But then also growing up in Atlanta, we deal with, like, the property that I live on is like old Civil War grounds, and some of the troops were camped out in the woods where I actually live before they burnt down the city. And they say if you want to get rid of something, you would burn it. And so Atlanta has been like this place where it's building over top of old structures, things that have been burnt down and tore down, and it's forever growing. We always say it, forever growing, never knowing. But Atlanta's been like that kind of place for me. So part of it was like dealing with like the Civil War, civil rights. Civil rights movement was real important. I grew up with a lot of kids whose parents were civil rights activists, to African American community that had a different kind of wealth at the time. But it was interesting for me to grow up in that kind of environment as opposed to my family being from New Jersey, which was really like countryside. And it was really like farms. And often people would assume that like a place like New Jersey would be like this city. But no, it was a country, it was a garden state. And so moving to Atlanta was a whole different environment. And another part of it was that my family was a part of the Underground Railroad on my father's side, meaning like Harriet Tubman once took runaway slaves to freedom north. And so part of it was just kind of coming back into those kind of environments and understanding and looking at them in a different way.
You made often the remark that you want to solve, let's say, things that are happening now by going back to the history.
Right.
Can you make that perhaps with the work we can see here? Can you make that a little bit more clear? What do you mean by that? I mean,
it's a strange thing. It's like, I use my studio as a church. I'm not a religious person. I feel like I'm a more spiritual person. In terms of my practice, is really about in search of a solution towards the problems, especially the world we live in today. I watch the news like a lot of people, and I'm constantly irritated to the point where I feel like I have to make work that has more like a spiritual presence. So in that way, I'm trying to solve problems. I'm trying to solve problems in the middle of the night. Right.
That's the best time to do it.
Right.
Okay. But going back in the history, that you also use material that goes back in the history. You
Right.
need material that has a history.
Well,
That goes automatically with it. I mean, that's a logical choice, let's say.
right. For instance, right before my grandmother died, and I remember I was finishing art school, my grandmother gave me like close to 400 photographs. And they were photographs from 1910, and they were family members. We didn't know much about a lot of the people that were in the photographs, but my grandmother felt like I should be the keeper of those images.
Yeah.
So often I use those images that would end up becoming discarded as like a spring point. So I can jump in and I use those images and respond to those images to make work and create stories. Sometimes the stories are like, there's a lot of truth, but then sometimes there's a lot of fiction. And I operate within that space.
Yeah. Because what amazes me is that you use, in fact, private material and
Right.
you turn it into something,
Personal.
yeah, not even personal, but perhaps even global.
Right. I hope to. I'm not sure I do it, but I hope to.
Yeah, because that's what you have in mind.
Yeah.
Because it's, of course, tricky to have, let's say, use photos of a family album,
Right.
because it can be very personal and very, but that's not what happens in your work. You
Right.
kind of lift it to a universal level.
I try to. I mean, I don't know if I do it,
But like perhaps you can, because here we have a couple of examples of where you use photos in a way that,
right. Like that one and that one on the wall right there was like from World War I, and I was dealing with African American soldiers that fought in World War I, and considering that it's almost like it's like a man that has no land and fighting for a country that doesn't necessarily love him. And so that I see those kind of images a lot. I have images that I use from like the Civil War that were family members. And a lot of times I'm making work and I don't necessarily have a destination, a thought, but it's more so a thought that I put out, and I put it out in such a way where I want it to bring in more answers as opposed to me having the answers for why. But the main reason why I may do is because I'm curious. I don't know if I answered that question.
more or less.
Thank you. It was always hard when I would make work and I would use images that were personal, that were from my family, but put it within the context of a gallery or a different kind of space. And my first attempt to do it, it was very uncomfortable. Now I'm at
Because you felt
I felt like there
were
were
that material?
No, I felt like it was just personal. It was like a family photograph. It was something that was, but I'm putting it out in a way. But then I realized that I'm kind of preserving it in a way, and that's kind of like my goal.
I have about the way you are working. I have the feeling that every new work has a relation with the one you did before, as if you are kind of make a continuation of. Well, a big installation, in fact.
Right. Yeah.
Is that true? Is that the way you work, or is it?
That's the way I work. I think I'm making work and I'm looking at it, looking at the work as like a book. And so every painting is a page. And so there are more and more pages. So it's on and on. I work with thought, but I continue on and I go back to older objects, and sometimes like figures become deities. They come back again. I use them at a certain moment when it feels appropriate. But yeah.
But I remember.
I'm still not answering your question, Emma.
You have a nice way to go around it. But it's still interesting, so it doesn't matter. There was another thing that because people try to categorize you. I mean, you are an African American artist, and you don't like that I think.
No, I do. It just depends.
On what?
How it's used. I think African American artists is very hard to define. We also want to be identified as American. We want to be a part of the bigger picture, but we also want to identify ourselves in a particular way. Number one, we don't necessarily know exactly what part of Africa we may have originated from, and plus we're also a mix of many people. And it's complicated to be treated a particular way because of the color of your skin. And I mean, just like the soldiers, in many ways, want to be accepted.
Yeah.
I want to be accepted. At the end of the day, I want to be seen as a human, as a person who has a voice that's just as relevant as anyone else. But it's very important for me to actually talk about those parts that are not necessarily acknowledged, and that's the part of having a relationship to Africa, and knowing that there's this separation between us by way of the ocean. And I find it's complicated. It's complicated history. Yeah. I mean, we were once called Negro, Black, African American.
Yeah.
It's hard to not really have a land that you can call your own.
Yeah.
And so that's where it gets complicated. And there are different political movements that see it in a different way too. Yeah. So, for me as an artist, I want to be known as an artist.
Yeah.
At the end of the day, I want to be known as a human.
Yeah.
I would just want to be respected.
Yeah.
But there's a choice why I say African American artists. That's just because I feel like, in many ways, we need to be acknowledged in terms of our contributions to the world. And I think that we've given a lot of contributions, and a lot of them haven't been acknowledged. And a part of it is just living in America, which is strange. Yeah.
To put it mildly.
Yeah.
But do you think there is a kind of a change in the way African American artists are treated now compared to when you started?
Yeah, I think so. I think the interest is different. But then also we speak different languages amongst ourselves, and we're very diverse.
You're not a group, let's say, with the same kind of...
We are in a way, but we just speak different languages. We see it in different ways. We live in different places. We have different approaches towards subjects. Some artists are more political in such a way. I find myself trying to deal with the history and the pains, but also want to deal with beauty. I'm real fascinated with beauty and understanding love of oneself. And I'm really about trying to deal with that. And often, I work in layers, and I deal within 7 layers, because I never knew when to finish, but a lot of the layers have to do with some of the complexities of who we are as well.
Is that also the reason why you use a lot of symbols?
Yeah, I'm really in search of symbols that exist in southern parts of the United States that are not necessarily talked about and looked upon the same way. There is certain architecture that was made on plantations, that were made by African Americans on plantations, that you could draw some connections to Congo, and you could draw some connections to different parts, and you can see it in a more natural way. Sound, rhythms, and things, and you can see it throughout musicians, where there's music that's similar in certain parts of the states. I mean, you can say James Brown, and you can talk about Fela. You can talk about Ali Fakatore, and you can talk about John Lee Hooker. And I think that there's those rhythms and that space right there in between the two that I find to be very important to put within my work, because I feel like those things will disappear, and we live in a different time where we live on Instagram and internet, and the younger people don't necessarily have those same connects in such a way.
But,
especially popular culture.
Yeah, but then isn't it more difficult for them if you use symbols for exactly that kind of people who are not interested so much? Do you make it more difficult?
No, yeah, I make it. I just try to make it as I don't respond or react. I'm not really concerned with reacting to what someone thinks.
Okay.
It's more so my own personal, like,
Yeah.
this is what I think.
Is it possible to, because we are looking at this work all the time now,
But
because talking about symbols, can you explain it a little bit with this work as an example?
it's a strange one.
You say that about your own work.
It's strange in a beautiful way to me.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, it's meant to be like poetry and being poetic, and part of it was like my background. And when I was a student, I was a sculpture major, and I made things in steel. But also, it is a relationship between music, and the idea was like, I did not knowing DNA before all this stuff came about. Music was the only way and closest connection to DNA. So music, I was real curious about sounds and rhythms from all around the world. So I used piano keys. And the idea with the piano keys is people have touched those piano keys and they played all different kinds of music, just like there may be like this thing about classical music, but as a jazz musician, sometimes jazz musicians rip up the classical music and bring it into a different way with the same kind of instruments and create something totally different. And so that's kind of part of it too. The bird, the falcon, and I use taxidermy sometimes. And some of this one in particular, I was fascinated with the falcons and the hawks that would fly in my backyard, and I could hear the sounds when I was in my studio. And often I work in the middle of the night, and sometimes I hear weird sounds of birds. And I don't listen to jazz music, but 80% of my work, I listen to jazz music and respond. Right.
So that,
It's called Nest. Anyway, yeah.
Okay, yeah. Now, we talked about it before. I have the feeling if I see your work, it reminds me of the work of Terry Atkins. Can you, is that a kind of a crazy idea? Or?
No, I think that there are a lot of older African American artists that use jazz music as a glue. And he was one of those artists that did the same. I would say like there were David Hammonds. I would say that there were many of a lot of the older artists, parts of the black arts movement, where jazz was a very important part. And I think in many ways they didn't necessarily want to divide the music from the art, but the artists in many ways brought a lot of it together in a certain way. But yeah, he was a friend. And I was introduced to him by one of my best friends, who used to be a director of a studio museum in Harlem, based on the fact of the way in which we work.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, and yeah.
There is a strange question, but there is a series here, Notes of Tervuren, and everybody who's living here has an association with Tervuren and the Africa Museum there.
Right.
We talked about it before. You said, in fact, my work doesn't have much to do with that.
Right.
But in what sense has it to do with here, with Tervuren, with the Africa Museum, with what they show there?
I came to visit back in, 2011, Carol? Was it 2011? Something like that. And was visiting a museum and just noticed so much African art that I don't think a lot of it has actually been seen with so much. And it fascinated me in a way where I would go to museums often in the United States. And, there are some museums that have a lot of African art, but then there are also some museums that have a small collection of African art that sits out in the same place all the time. And I was always fascinated with it. And it's always interesting to be able to go and see African art in a different context. Not necessarily one that I may feel like I enjoy, but in a museum in a different way. And so I've always wanted to, after coming to the museum here, I wanted to make this body. It's not specifically about here, but it's more about like the reaction towards African art when I see a museum. And I think it's interesting how the African art has traveled its way, and it influences and affects people in many different ways. And so that's what that was about in terms of me collecting and keeping notes.
Yeah, but wasn't it also that you kind of realized, because you use African images, but in a completely different context.
Right.
I mean, it's kind of makes it more real. I mean,
I don't know about that, but
no, but
I wish I
the
could.
difference between what African museums always do is put it in a Western context, switch the light off, and it's Africa.
Right. Yeah.
You use your material in a completely different way. I mean, it honors more what it is about.
I think so. I think I'm having a private conversation with it.
Yeah.
And sometimes it seems surreal. Yeah. But it's also, I felt like our experiences are very surreal. You know, just to understand like my own personal or family's histories of crossing the Atlantic and not necessarily knowing and feeling in a position of trying to recover a history. So yeah, that's kind of where my brain goes when I'm working with it. And also it's like I'm really about the beauty. I can't explain the practices and the things that were happening. I know what I know from what I read, but I also take a different approach where I look at it, I spend time with it, and think about it from an artist's perspective.
Mm-hmm. So you were laughing when we talked about it before, because I want to ask you, what does it mean to be an artist under a Trump presidency? Does that make a difference for you? I'm just curious, because I'm wondering how you deal with that. Because there is never, they told me in many galleries, there are never so much black shows in America as there are now.
Right.
Is that kind of an answer?
It's kind of like humorous every morning. It's sad and it's depressing. Humorous in the morning when the news is on and you hear about all the crazy tweets and the craziness, and you scratch your head, I can't believe this guy is doing this. But I have to shut it out.
But it doesn't influence your work or the way you are working? Or?
No, I would refuse to let it be a part of my work.
Okay.
Because I don't want any of that bad energy towards me, towards something that I'm trying to make that's peaceful.
Yeah. Do you have a view on the future?
Yeah.
Is the future something that's...
I think that's a big part of my work. My favorite musician is Sun Ra. And Sun Ra was from Birmingham, Alabama, but Sun Ra believed that he was from Saturn. And I sometimes think that when you bring things, sounds from the past, the present, in many ways, when you put those things together, like in hip hop culture, we do sampling, we use music from our parents, and we put that music together and we change the rhythm of it. We put it together like we live like in somewhat of a collage culture where we put things from different time periods together to make something that's more futuristic, that takes us and transports us in a different space, gives us a different sound and rhythm. And I hope to do that with my work. But yeah, I know I danced around your question, but I answered it in another way.
Thanks a lot for...
Thank you.
We know a little bit more about your work now, and thanks for telling us.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.